This is the Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 5th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? This child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Before I dive in today, just a couple of quick notes. First of all, these beautiful flowers help to celebrate Ed and Lynn Gunnett's 55th, and they're ushering today. Happy anniversary. Secondly, what's that? Helen and Pete as well, yeah. Same day.
Yes.
Same day, same year.
Same year, 2 hours apart.
Different counties or different states?
Different states.
Different states, okay. Also, we're so glad to have SK back, but I also want to say thank you to Janice, who played so capably and so beautifully over the past couple of weeks while SK was gallivanting about in Italy. Just kidding. But thank you to Janice. And how about for Margaret today? There she is back there, singing a solo today in drop-in choir. Well done. Okay, I feel better. Friends, grace and peace to you from God the Creator and the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Of all the news that is out there right now, it has been a news-heavy week for sure. Mostly revolves around a couple of particular people. And I've been paying a lot of attention to really a specific kind of news. I wonder if you have too. This week it's been sandwich news. And yeah, that's a ridiculous way to start a sermon. And yeah, it might be because some of this is going to be tongue-in-cheek, and it might be because it's summertime and our brains are on vacation even if our bodies aren't, and my brain has been baked in this weather over the past couple of weeks. So yeah, sure. And maybe it could be that keeping up with actual world news and politics is just overwhelming, and if you don't laugh sometimes, you'll just cry. So here we go, sandwich news. Turns out that a Long Island deli is making waves all over New York with their new sandwich that boasts a pickle for a bun. I kind of laughed at that, but I clicked on the headline, and I stopped laughing when I read that they were selling 250 of them a day. You can put whatever you want in there. Bottom of the list for me, hot dog and tuna salad, but there were a couple others that sounded okay. For me, it actually brought back like nightmarish, waking flashbacks of KFC's Double Down sandwich. Does anybody remember that? The Double Down, if you have blocked it from your memory or compartmentalized it and buried it, was 2 pieces of fried chicken as the bun, and then inside was a glop of cheese and bacon. Couple things about that. When it first came out, I remember one commentator saying, well, they're calling it the Double Down, which kind of implies that you're gambling with your health, which I think is absolutely true. And the other thing about it, now I have to admit that I never actually ate one, but I know people who did, and the chicken is really hot. So you had to like burn yourself to eat this thing. The same person said, that's crazy Roman emperor stuff. Like, hey, I really like your food, KFC. Prove it by burning yourself. Anyway, lots of other headlines this week. I don't want to waste your time here. So just briefly, it turns out in a new study, your favorite sandwich says a lot about your personality. If you're a PB&J kind of person, you're a more maybe simplistic or whatever. The more and more deluxe you get, maybe the more extra you are, that kind of thing. They're also saying that the way that you cut your sandwich and the way that you eat your sandwich it sort of shows a whole lot about your personality. And I'm going to admit that I didn't read every word of those articles, but apparently it makes a difference. I'm a diagonal cut grilled cheese kind of a person, but whatever. Either way, we have to admit that this is a very first world issue, is it not? While the citizens of first world countries get online and argue with each other, Reuben, no, grilled cheese with tomato. There are other members of the human family that don't have enough to eat or don't know where their next meal is coming from. But as for me, okay, diagonally cut grilled cheese, sure, tomato soup never hurts. Who knows? Maybe your favorite sandwich does say a lot about your personality. For me, my favorite sandwich isn't actually one that you eat. My favorite sandwich is actually the Markan sandwich. Anybody? You just heard one in the gospel. That is a classic Markan sandwich with all the fixins. That is an actual term that is taught in seminaries worldwide about how to read the gospel and get the most out of it. The Markan sandwich is a literary device, a way of telling the story, especially in the Gospel of Mark, that tells us about a lot of specific details, but also reveals much broader truth. And the literary device is the Markan sandwich because you really have one story as, let's say, the focaccia on either side, and then you've got a story in the middle, but it's really how the two stories interplay that reveals something bigger than the details of the two stories themselves. That's what reveals the truth that transcends. Today we find a classic and important Markan sandwich, and again, it's got all the fixins. It comes fresh with the bread of the daughter of Jairus, and then there's a woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. I don't want to overdo the metaphor, but let's say she's the PB&J or the Vegemite or whatever it is that you like. And the way that the story plays out in Mark chapter 5 is actually striking and quite beautifully crafted. First, we need to know that since last Sunday when we heard about Jesus calming the storm, peace, be still, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Well, since then, and the lectionary skips this part, but he and the disciples have landed on the far side of the Sea of Galilee. It is Gentile territory, and Jesus has cured or driven out the legion demons from the Gerasene demoniac. And I want to be careful. I believe the correct wording today is the Gerasene person experiencing demonic possession. That's important. But whatever. Therefore, as our gospel begins today and we hear that they had landed again on the other side, it means that they have now made the trip back across about 13 miles over the sea, back across the Sea of Galilee, and landed back in their own Hebrew neighborhoods that they'd be very familiar with. It is decidedly, the disciples will tell us, safer, and it's also cleaner, and it's more familiar. And so it makes sense that Jesus is immediately confronted by a man named Jairus, whom we are told is a leader of the synagogue. He reports that his daughter is ill, near death. And it might be a worthwhile moment just to pause and to point out that this Markan sandwich is made with a healthy dash of desperation, which is encouraging, actually. It encourages us that coming to Jesus or turning to Jesus, even if it's a last resort, is a good and faithful thing to do. It reminds us that whatever we might be facing or how helpless we feel, turning to Jesus is always an option. It is never too late. And that theme, or let's call it that flavor, carries over into the middle of the sandwich, the story about this woman. For while they're on their way to Jairus' house, we are introduced to a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. She too is at her wit's end and her last resort. She's heard about Jesus, which is important. Maybe it, as a church, causes us to stop and reflect, how is our community hearing about how amazing Jesus is? How are we spreading that message? But she has heard about Jesus, and despite all the failings of all of her efforts so far, which have included many physicians and spending everything she has so that she is now destitute, she trusts that Jesus might well be the answer. If I but touch the hem of his robe, I will be healed. Again, desperation is spread on pretty thick here. It's a wonderful reminder that Jesus meets us right where we are, even if it's at the end of our rope. As a matter of fact, she's been hemorrhaging as long as Jairus' daughter has been alive. So do we think that's just kind of a coincidence? No, of course not. These two stories become enmeshed together. This is no small coincidence, and neither is it a coincidence that Jesus can feel in his body that power has gone out from him, and it causes him to stop and say, "Who is it that touched my cloak?" His disciples are flabbergasted. You see all these people? How can you ask who touched my cloak? We're surrounded by people here. But, coincidence or not, she can also feel it in her body as she is made well. Finally, Jesus doesn't just satisfy the soul or redeem the spirit, but he makes miracles happen in flesh and blood, both on that day and every day still now. Spoiler alert, we will see this sandwich all come together as Jesus doesn't just raise Jairus' daughter from the sleep of death, but then turns around and tells the people there, "Give her something to eat." This isn't just some kind of a spiritual or a metaphorical rising. This is the resurrection of the body in full view. The little girl is risen, not just in a way that we can feel in our tender hearts, but in a way that she can feel in her belly, and that's important. Just like we gather every week, at least once a week, around a meal, the meal of Jesus' body and blood, we remember and celebrate that feeds the soul, but it also feeds the belly. There's actual tangible food and drink there. Jesus cares for all in ways that care for their spirit, but also in ways that care for their bodies. Jesus fills the soul and the belly. So there's some similarities between Jairus, his daughter, and the woman whom Jesus heals, but there's also some really important differences. And the way that Mark has written it, we're absolutely supposed to hold these characters up and say, what's the same and what's different? And these might just be what bring us to the grander truth of the story. Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, is wealthy. He has messengers. Ooh, that's pretty bougie. And their message to us is that he is part of the upper crust. He has high social standing. He is ritually pure, basically all of the time. He has a family, a household, and he gets right up to the front of the line to see Jesus, even though there's a big and tightly packed crowd surrounding him. That's no mistake. This guy has some pull. The woman, on the other hand, we don't get to know her name. She has spent everything that she had. She is destitute. She is ritually impure from the bleeding. Now, we have to pause for 1 second and say we're not exactly sure what kind of consequence that might have in her life. We certainly don't want to heap shame upon her already difficult circumstances. But how scary and how painful must it be to be bleeding for 12 years? And whatever her status, she seems to be alone. She knifes her way through the back end of the crowd and makes plans to simply touch Jesus' cloak. And it surely seems as though she doubts that she'll be granted an audience with the teacher. But she fully trusts that should she get a hand on that cloak, she will be healed. She's got the essential part down. And the most shocking part of the story might just be that Jesus doesn't treat her as an interruption. He's on an important mission. I really wish we had a footnote about how Jairus was feeling when Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" And then has this conversation. Jairus is probably standing there going, "Do you remember when I told you that my little girl is on the verge of death? Come on." But Jesus doesn't treat her like an interruption. He gives freely of his power, he gives freely of his time, he gives freely of his blessing, and rather than him being made unclean by her touch, as per the law, his purity and love flows freely to her, and she is made both clean and well. That is the power of Jesus. But this mission to save Jairus' daughter is still in motion. All are cared for in the way that they need. In this way, Jesus is embodying the Old Testament idea of God's mishpat, justice. Not that everybody gets what they deserve, although we clamor for that sometimes, but that everybody gets what they need. And so Jesus is embodying God's justice here. I may not be impressing you this morning with my sandwich metaphors, but I hope that I am impressing upon you that the Markan sandwich packs a punch. It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful device in the way that it reveals big truth to us. In this case, we could simplify and just say Jesus doesn't care about status, wealth, or power. Jesus came for all, no exceptions. And may we be inspired throughout this summer by him, through the rest of the year even, or in our life together moving forward, to focus on ministries that don't just uplift and fulfill the spirit of our community, but fills their bellies too, offers them something tangible, just like Jesus does. Especially this year. We might feel it's been a tough week. We might feel like we have a couple of pretty uncool sandwiches to take a bite of. We may be filled in our hearts and our spirits and our bellies by the bread of heaven, Jesus, who inspires us to choose justice, to choose kindness, to choose love each and every day. He will fill us up in spirit and in belly so that we might do that work together. Thanks be to God. Amen.